Hello, one and all. Bienvenue à tous. If you're tuning in live, thanks for making time for us in your busy day. If you're watching this on YouTube, thanks for stopping by. Whichever way you're watching, welcome to Post Media's third season of Driving into the Future. Today, the subject we're tackling is, can Canada become an EV manufacturing superpower? I'm David Booth, and I'm the senior writer of Driving.ca. Canada, as we all know, has abundant natural resources. The rush to electrification, the big question for the Canadian auto industry is, how do we use that abundance to become an EV manufacturing powerhouse? Can it be leveraged into the battery assembly plants that will fuel a booming auto manufacturing sector? And what roadblocks does the protectionist American Inflation Reduction Act create for our electrified future? Most importantly, what should Canada's realistic goals for a booming EV auto business, and how are they best attained? To help us answer all those questions and more, we're joined today by Mark Adams, Vice President and Global Mining Market Lead for SNC-Lavalin, Scott McKenzie, Director, Corporate and External Affairs of Toyota Canada, David Patterson, Vice President, Corporate and Environmental Affairs for GM Canada, and finally, Brendan Sweeney, Managing Director of Trillium Network for Advanced Manufacturing. Welcome, gentlemen. Thanks so much for joining me today. Before we start the proceedings today, let me welcome all our viewers and let them know that at the end of this forum, we'll be joined by Victor Fedeli, Ontario's Minister of Economic Development, Job Creation and Trade, who will answer a few questions on any new development in Ontario's quest for electric vehicle manufacturing. So, gentlemen, what a truly exciting time to be in the automotive industry. We're in the midst of the biggest revolution in mobility since the birth of the automobile, and Canada could be on the cusp of an auto manufacturing boom. But before we become an EV powerhouse, a lot of things have to come together, and I'm hoping you're just the people to tell us how Canada can get there. Mark, if you don't mind, I'll start with you. It seems that as with so many things, Canada's best foot forward here is our natural resources. But what are the materials a modern EV battery most needs? Do we currently mine all of them in Canada? And how much of those raw minerals are we mining or could mine in the future?
Yeah, thanks, David. Thanks so much for having me today. So there are different types of EV batteries out there. They use a mix of various metals and minerals. Some of those include nickel, lithium, graphite, cobalt, and others. And that could change in the future. That's currently what we're using. And I'm sure we'll hear from our other panelists today about battery chemistries going forward. Canada currently produces all of those metals and minerals except for lithium. We produce about 150,000 tons per year of nickel. As I mentioned, we don't produce any lithium right now. We have in the past, but economic pressures have forced us to shut down the few operations that we did have. And for graphite and cobalt, we produce minimal in Canada. Most of that is imported. And to meet our 2050 net zero goals, EVs included, the world needs to ramp up production of those other metals and minerals, lithium, graphite, and cobalt in particular, by about 450% from now until 2050. So in terms of what do we have in the ground in Canada that we could be taking advantage of, Canada currently has about 3 million tons of nickel reserves in the country. And when we say reserves, those are numbers that we're pretty confident in, that there's about 3 million. It could be a lot more. In terms of lithium, we actually have about the same. So that tells you something about the potential for lithium in this country, where we've got about the same amount of nickel reserves as we do lithium reserves, but we're currently not mining any of it in Canada. Graphite and cobalt, we actually have minimal reserves in Canada compared to the rest of the country. You know, those are some of the smaller constituents as well. So if we were to mine all of the nickel in Canada that we currently have in reserves and use it in EV batteries, we could probably produce about 100 million EV batteries. Of course, I'm making assumptions on the size and chemistry and quality, et cetera. But even saying that 100 million batteries, that's not completely realistic, but it's an interesting thing to consider. Couple of the reasons why it's not completely realistic is not all reserves can be mined successfully. So even though we've got 3 million tons of nickel in the ground, there's economic, technical, and social reasons why we might not be able to actually mine that and produce it into metal. We also couldn't mine it all at once because it generally in this country and around the world takes 10 or more years, and even 10 years is probably generous, to go through the various study stages, engineering and design and construction to bring a mine online. And lastly, when we look at nickel or lithium, not all of that metal that's currently mined in the world is currently used for EV batteries. So in terms of nickel, only 6% of all nickel that's mined globally is actually used in battery production. The vast majority is used to make steel. In contrast to that, for lithium, that is its main use. 70% of the lithium in the world is actually used for EV battery production. So I guess to sum up on your question, David, I think the metal reserves in Canada give us a lot of potential to be more independent and produce a lot more ourselves. But it's not as simple as just digging up a chunk of solid nickel out of the ground and it's ready to use. There's a lot of other considerations there as well.
Thanks very much, Mark. I mean, 100 million EVs. I understand your reservations, but boy, that sounds promising. I hope we can get that message out to the world. Brendan, I know that your company Trillium has mapped out a bunch of possible outcomes for all aspects of the Canadian auto sector. What does your research say could happen as the auto industry transforms to electric power?
Well, it says that there is a real range of possibilities for the future of the industry. It says there's a lot at stake. And this range of possibilities, it really kind of depends on how we choose to approach and how we choose to support this transition. And what our recent report shows that if we just take our recent wins, we had a great couple of years, right? We had a great calendar 2022. If we take these wins, carry along as we're doing now, by 2030, we'll likely have an EV supply chain from tip to tail across the country that contributes about $9 billion directly to GDP annually and employs about 35,000 people. When you add some of the spin-off benefits, you're looking at about 25 billion in GDP, maybe 145,000 jobs spread across a number of nodes of the supply chain. So not bad, right? But if we really push the agenda, if we really work to create the right conditions for investment, the right conditions for growth, we can grow this number substantially along the lines of $26 billion in direct contributions to GDP annually, 91,000 really good jobs in leading automotive, leading mining, leading EV technology companies. Then when you add on top of that the spin-off benefits, that the numbers just become astronomical. More than 300,000 jobs across the country. So those are our upper and lower boundaries of our report. Where we're more likely to fall, probably somewhere in the middle. And to maximize that opportunity, we're going to need a substantial amount of capital investment. We're going to need a lot of willpower across the stakeholders, government and industry. And we're going to need some time. So this isn't going to happen overnight. This might be, and as Mark mentions, for mining, the timelines can be 10 years plus. So.
Thanks very much for that, Brendan. Scott, Toyota already has a huge manufacturing presence here in Canada with its Cambridge and Woodstock plants. What are the lessons learned from building that business that can be directly applied to maintain and, as Brendan said, even increase our auto manufacturing footprint here in Canada as the world switches to electrified vehicles?
Yeah, thanks, David. Toyota has a pretty proud and successful history in Canada. We started back in 1988, producing about 50,000 Corollas a year. And, today we've got a capacity over 500,000 vehicles per year. And we make some of the most desirable products, within our lineup. We're in a pretty good position, but over the years, starting out with that low volume, we developed a reputation for good manufacturing quality. And, that allowed us to attract Lexus production. We were the first Lexus plant outside of Japan. And, we grew from there. But, at the end of the day, any investment decision, you need to be competitive. And, as much as we've had those intangibles in Canada, we've got a highly skilled workforce, great people, a good operating environment within which we, do our business. We need to make money. And, if you're going to attract future investments, you need to be competitive. And, we've always done a good job at that, at our operations in Canada, making sure that we are efficient with our resources and making sure that, we're an attractive place to invest in the future. And, the same thing applies in this discussion in Canada. We're talking about building out, electrification and battery supply chains. It's great that we have these intangibles in Canada. It's great that we have these natural resources, but at the end of the day, you still need to be competitive. And that's something that we need to consider.
Thanks a lot. Yeah. Money talks, right? So Scott, thanks. David, General Motors has already taken first steps in building an EV manufacturing infrastructure in Canada with its Bécancour plant in Quebec that I think produces the materials for cathodes. Why don't you walk us through what that is and how it benefits a Canadian EV supply chain? And most importantly, what goes on behind the scenes to bring such a plant to Canada? How is it pitched to the American head offices? How does government get involved? I mean, if we're to hope that Canada gets a larger share of the EV supply chain world, it really helps to know how the decisions are made.
Thanks, David. Thanks for having me here today. I mean, I find it amazing to think back that it was just 2 years ago, GM announced our intention to have our entire light-duty fleet transformed to full battery electric. And it has been an incredibly busy 2 years, nowhere less than here in Ontario and across Canada. And just as a quick thumbnail, in the last year, we've reopened the Oshawa plant. We are on 3 shifts there. Half of them are women. We had the opening of a new test track in Oshawa where we test our software that's done in Markham with over 1,000 people. We have announced a dozen new electric vehicles that are coming to market, 2 of which were launched this year, a lot more coming next year. Vehicles like the full battery electric Chevrolet Equinox that's going to sell at a $35,000 point with our Ultium battery system. And so Bécancour, yes, also another addition to this. And I'm definitely bullish on where we are in Ontario and Quebec and Canada for the future. What that is, as you say, we're under construction now. It's a cathode active material plant, probably the first in North America. And that is going to process the minerals that Mark Adams talked about. Particularly nickel. We've just announced with Vale, which is one of our great Canadian nickel producers from our mines in Sudbury and all over Canada, that they will be making, for the first time really outside of China, nickel sulfate, which will be a key input into that processing plant. And as well, we'll have inputs of other Canadian and other nickel and other products going into that plant. And just the nickel alone from that we've signed up with Vale will help us produce over 350,000 vehicles. And we're planning to be producing 1 million electric vehicles in North America per year by 2025. So we're going very quick. And all of these things, from software to testing to production, are really critical from end to end of mines to mobility, and there's a lot more coming. We're just getting started. So we're very, very high on what we can do in Canada. We call it a generational opportunity. I come from a mining family, and so believe me, it's exciting to see the connection between mining and automotive, and where better than right here in Canada to be able to do all of that.
Thanks a lot, Dave. So, Mark, so far we've talked about simply mining of materials, but that's what Canada has always done, supplied the world with raw materials. How do we become a part of the value-added processing chain? China, I believe, has cornered more than 3/4 of the worldwide business in processing some of the metals used in battery manufacturing. The nickel sulfate, I think that David just mentioned, is one of those. How do we get some part of that action? What are the advantages that Canada might offer automakers looking to offset their exposure to China?
Yeah, thanks, David. So yeah, as I mentioned earlier, Canada has a lot of mineral reserves, but they don't occur in solid metal form generally in the earth. We need to extract them, process them, and refine them into the minerals and metals that we need to use ultimately, say as feeders to create EV batteries. Generally speaking, extraction and processing is what we've done in Canada in the past. And we've largely, as you mentioned, David, we've outsourced the refining, meaning the final step of producing the metal that we want to actually use in the manufacturing process. Don't get me wrong, there are refining facilities in Canada, such as for nickel. David talked about that a little bit, but we haven't built them for a while. And over the years, I think we've fallen into a place of complacency of allowing foreign exporters to dominate a large part of that mining supply chain. But we have a compelling case to make as to why this is good to do this work in our country. Employment, strong safety and environmental standards, strong permitting and community engagement processes, et cetera. We're also looking much earlier in when we build a mine or a refining facility as to how we can incorporate sustainability into that mine design. So, using renewable energy sources, optimizing the processes, and implementing technologies to reduce emissions as an example. Mining in Canada today is very different than what it was even 40 years ago. So bringing more of that mining supply chain to Canada means benefits for GDP, local jobs, positioning ourselves as a trusted trade partner for other countries. We just need the will to do it. The same way that we need to be building a host of new renewable infrastructure needed to power all these EVs. And I think we've lost the drive on many of these infrastructure new builds, and we really need to break that inertia.
Wow. Well, let's hope all our governments get involved in rectifying this. Dave, I'm going to go back to you. The federal government, namely Innovation, Science and Industry Minister François-Philippe Champagne, has been pitching a mines to mobility message to automakers around the globe, hoping to attract battery manufacturers with Canada's abundant minerals and clean energy. Recently, however, the Americans have passed something called the Inflation Reduction Act. And there is some pretty protectionist legislature in there that would seem to discourage anyone contemplating building a battery plant in Canada. I worked through the numbers and I just found it incredible. Could you walk us through the impending rules, how it's applied to battery manufacturing, and most importantly, how much money is involved in this process?
Sure, David. Yeah, it's a really important geopolitical development on a global basis. And I'll say off the top, I think, our front line in hockey terms of Champagne, Fidelli, and Fitzgibbons is a pretty good line to be putting on the ice. And I'll let you guess who's on the right wing and who's on the left wing. But the point is that we can get things done. And it's going to be important because what has taken place just recently this summer with the Clean Energy Act in the United States is really significant and monumental. And I think first of all you have to step back and why do we have it? It's about fighting climate change. It's a massive act to invest in advancing and going quickly on the technology that is going to be needed, and electric vehicles and the entire supply chain that goes with that is a massive transformation, the biggest transformation in our industry since horses. And so to be able to do that, what the Inflation Reduction Act does is help fight climate change by advancing technology, and it will have a very significant job creation opportunity. And we are very lucky to be part of North America because we have a integrated automotive sector. The numbers, as you say, are really very, very significant. And you have to understand it, I think, in two aspects. The first is that there is a very well sort of publicized number, which is $7,500 of a tax credit that was available to an American buyer of an electric vehicle that will start at the beginning of this next year and sort of resets the incentive support. So that's roughly $10,000 federal money per purchase of a full battery electric vehicle on two conditions. Half of it is that the battery components are sourced from the United States. And the second is that the mineral and the critical mineral and the processing takes place in either in North America or in trade-friendly jurisdictions. And so this is to accelerate that supply chain that we've talked about here in North America. The good news for Canadians is if we look at critical minerals as one of our competitive advantages, Mark talked about nickel because, you know, we're blessed with nickel much more so than anywhere else in North America. We have the ability to tap into some of that support, even the defense procurement provisions that are part of that, because we're part of this integrated industry. The manufacturing aspect is the other part. And there are very large manufacturing tax credits for companies that are going to do electric vehicle manufacturing, battery manufacturing, and critical supply chain work in the United States. And at our investor day, for example, last week at General Motors, we were asked, what is the per car value of that type of tax credit? And we said that it was somewhere between $3,500 and $5,500 per car in terms of support. So that's an enormous amount. I've said that we're going to be making 1 million EVs per year. You can do the math. It's a pretty significant support that is there. So what we need to do, in my view, is keep up. And we have already for months and months been working with our governments here in Canada to say, how do we take full advantage of what we have being in North America? How do we keep up, focus on keeping what we have, and then really double down on the natural advantages we have, like our nickel industry, like processing opportunities, et cetera.
Okay, thanks very much. Scott, the manufacturing tax credit that Dave mentioned, unfortunately, seems to only go to battery plants built in the United States. I've done some back of the napkin calculations, and they could be getting like $1 million subsidy each plant each year.
Billion.
So how does that affect us trying to build battery plants here in Canada? And how, what can we do to alleviate this?
Yeah, and thanks, David. David Patterson covered, both the consumer tax credit and also the investment tax credit. Looking at the 45X, which is what you're talking about, specifically in the investment tax credit, worst case, it's a huge problem for us in Canada. And, we need to take it seriously because it's basically incentivizing production of batteries in the United States at a level that, would be at least challenging for Canada to compete with. But there's a couple things we need to consider with that. And, one of them is the CBO estimate that came along with the IRA. 45X and 45C, which are two different investment tax credits, were estimated at about $37 billion combined for both of them. And David, I know you've run numbers. We've all run our own numbers, and the actual potential of that is considerably higher than that, and maybe 10 times higher than that. And those two things, at some point, they need to be reconciled. The second point I'll say is that the IRA has been signed into law, but the regulation behind it is still being written and it's not finalized. So until we actually see the regulation, we won't understand clearly, the full impact. The third thing is the Republicans recently took back the House in the US. And so, going into the next Congress next year, they control the purse strings. So even though the policy says one thing, the money needs to be there to support the policy. And that's, at this point, not a guaranteed outcome. And then I'll say the fourth thing is, in the US, you're really talking about policy. And the IRA, the potential funding is policy, whereas in Canada with SIF funding and also the provincial funding that Minister Fedeli can speak to, it's contracts. There's a lot more certainty. So in the US, yeah, it does look very, very challenging, but from a policy standpoint, every 2 years, potentially you might be dealing with a different policy environment. So And then finally, as a global automaker with operations all around the world, and David can speak to that as well from his company. We manufacture in a lot of places. As a global automaker, putting all of your eggs in one basket, meaning moving all of your production into the United States, maybe not the strongest idea. So we need to consider all of those things, when we're making investment decisions. It is serious. We need to take it seriously. But at the same time, there may be some light at the end of the tunnel.
Thanks very much for that, Scott. Sobering news. Brendan, it would seem that some of the news about the Inflation Reduction Act has focused mostly on the positive aspect for Canada, the consumer incentives that David mentioned. The 45X, it's called the Advanced Manufacturing Production Tax Credit, I believe, seems to really promote the battery plants, however, to be built only in the United States. Now, when you made your initial projections, I think you mentioned that we could get 2 major and 2 smaller battery plants in Canada. If the IRA is enacted as it's written, what are the chances that we reach that goal now? Or should we be shifting our focus elsewhere as we try to get future growth in the auto manufacturing sector?
Yeah, so in our report, we modeled a scenario where by 2030, we had 4 battery cell plants operating in Canada in 2030. And I don't know how realistic that ever was, but we wanted to show a scenario that we could aspire to, and just to show how valuable that was. In the event that 45X and the IRA are enacted in the way it's written now, the chances that we reach that goal do go down. But to Scott's point, we're kind of still waiting to see if the policymakers in the US really do the math and realize exactly how much that's going to cost. But in that event, I mean, we've got to really, in addition to battery cells, we've always got to focus on assembly. You're never going to move me off that. It's so important. It's so valuable, especially to communities in and around Southern Ontario. Where I also really see the opportunity to create something world leading where nothing has existed before, at least in North America. And that's what we call the integrated battery materials industry. And so this means better integrating Canada's mineral resources and our mining sector with our manufacturing industry, in this case, battery materials, and just integrating it to an extent that we've not done before in the past, treating our mineral resources as the foundation to create a new segment of manufacturing, battery materials, rather than just treating our mineral resources an opportunity to rip and ship, to pull things out of the ground, ship them to our trading partners, and watch them reap the economic benefits of those resources which, let's remember, are for the most part the property of the citizenry in Canada. So maintaining a focus on assembly and developing an integrated battery materials industry will help ensure that we get maximum economic impact from these investments moving forward.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, it would certainly seem so. I mean, for the listeners out there, the IRA and the 45X we've been talking about gives battery manufacturers in the United States as much as $45 per kilowatt hour for every battery they make for the next 10 years. And only if that battery plant or battery cell plant is in the United States. And, I've seen some estimates of up to $1 billion each and every year as subsidy. I mean, those are the kind of freaky numbers I think Scott was talking about. Anyways, moving on to you, Mark. If we listen to Brendan and we factor in this protectionist 45X agreement in the IRA, I think we've all figured out that mining and processing is Canada's ace in the hole. And it really seems, at least on this panel, we have a general consensus that it's imperative that Canada start processing more of these minerals than just exporting stuff straight from the ground. is the federal government providing enough support for companies that want to get in the EV infrastructure business? And are there additional advantages to automakers looking to friendshore their EV manufacturing in Canada?
Yeah, thanks, David. And I think Brendan said it really well, and I'll echo some of his comments. But I would say, generally speaking, I've been quite impressed with our government's recent support for the mining industry generally. I think the industry and government are telling the same story, which is that mining is absolutely essential as an enabler of a net zero future. We need metals and minerals in order to produce that infrastructure to get us to net zero, and EV batteries are one of a big component of that. In the government's most recent discussion paper on their critical minerals strategy, they said that they wanted to secure the entire value chain and connect domestically mined and processed minerals and metals with domestic manufacturing. And I'm sure, like we said, that is something that everyone on this panel is on board with and would like to see. For me, really, the next steps are actually seeing more of the actions and timelines out of that discussion paper and strategy. And how I think the other thing that's really important is not only the strategy and what are we going to do about that, but how is the government going to help educate the Canadian public on the role of sustainable mining, the importance of keeping these metals in Canada, processing them domestically for the economic and net zero future benefits.
Mark, just following up on that, is there anything that the government can do to facilitate this stuff? More specific, like is Canada particularly onerous on the allowing permissions for new mines, allowing permissions for new processing plants? Is there some way should we be cutting through bureaucracy? What are the improvements we could probably have right now?
Yeah, I think there are improvements we've made, David. I think our process, the permitting and approvals process in Canada, is very robust. I think some would say that there's a bit of bureaucracy in there, but I think on the flip side, like I said, we have very strict social and environmental standards in this country, and I think we should be proud of those as well. So it's finding a way of balancing, that need to protect the environment and communities, Indigenous communities across the country, with making sure that we reduce the time it takes to get some of these facilities online. Like I said, like David said, a lot of these facilities take 10 plus years to get online. And I think that there's a way that we could still be responsible environmentally and socially, but bring these projects online faster. So, I think that that's a big part of what the actions the government and timelines the government needs to pull out of the strategy they've set up, which like I said, I am impressed with, but I really think that's the next step.
Thanks. David, so where does GM go from here in Canada? I believe we're about to start production of your brake drop electric delivery vans. But moving forward, how can we get more of those mainstream products for General Motors rapid transmission to EVs? And is the government doing everything they should to attract automakers looking for that transition to EVs? What could they be doing to make your life easier?
Well, they're already doing a lot of what they need to do to make life easier. And to just pick a little bit up on what Mark was saying, really, in many cases, it's about speed. And especially as we get down, and as automakers, we're now participating much more, owning into our supply chain at a deeper level than we have before. So who would have thought that General Motors would be investing in a cathode active material production plant and have it up by 2025? We're going fast on those things, but speed is really the essence. They know this in the mining industry really well. In fact, if we could take some of the sort of regulatory alignment issue or work that we've done in Ontario, for example, that we've applied in our auto plants. And so, as you mentioned, we've been converting one of our auto plants to be fully battery electric, and watch this space. Won't be very long before we're up and producing. But we cut down in the automotive area some of our regulatory timing by about 80%, working with Ontario. That was remarkable. That's probably best in class in North America. If we can take that kind of thinking, remove overlaps in terms of some of the jurisdictional areas, where, whether it's environmental or other areas that overlap between federal and provincial, then we can maintain environmental quality, which is critical, especially when the whole point is to put vehicles on the road that don't have a GHG footprint. You want to make sure that the entire ecosystem going back to mining is done as effectively and as quickly as possible. And I'll just add one other thing too, is when we talk about mining, and we're already factoring this into our cathode active material, which is called Ultium CAM, and that is recycling. In about 10 years, you're going to start seeing the first wave of electric vehicles coming off the road. The batteries in electric vehicles will last longer than the vehicles themselves. And we have companies, and we're investing in a few of them here in Canada, that have the ability to recycle the materials within those batteries. And so instead of only using virgin materials from mining, we'll have the ability to also use as feedstock some of the recycled battery capability as well. So we've got a little bit of time to get ahead of that. And if we're smart in Canada, we'll set up so that we can be the lead in those things too. So economic opportunity is coming out our ears. We just have to make sure that we keep on top of it and working together.
Okay, thanks. Scott, everybody seems to have been talking about the transformation to electrification as if it's a light switch. 1 minute your factory is producing internal combustion engines, the next everything's battery powered. But it doesn't always work that way, does it? Is there another approach for an automaker looking to make that transmission without such a dramatic schism? I mean, at the current time, I think Toyota makes something like 400,000 RAV4s here in Canada. How do you manage a transition from, say, hybrids to EVs without interrupting the labor force, without job interruptions?
Yeah, thanks, David. Like, I don't think you want it to work that way, meaning, an abrupt transition, at least not for, what some people would call a traditional automotive manufacturer, for like a new entrant in automotive manufacturing, where they're just building capacity of, for instance, battery electric vehicles only. It's a different story for them. But for us, we have an established workforce here, an established operation, and we need to manage that transition carefully. And, you mentioned the RAV4. I mentioned earlier, we're really lucky, and to an extent, I think we've earned it. But we're blessed with the models that we make in Canada. You mentioned the RAV4. It's the number 2 selling, model globally, actually behind only the Corolla, which, we used to make here, and obviously it's a Toyota model as well. And we also make 2 pretty exciting Lexus products. We make about 70% of all of the Lexus sold in Canada, between the 2 models we make here. So we're pretty lucky. And, with RAV4, we sell in North America more than 500,000 a year. And, the lion's share of those are made at our plants in Cambridge and Woodstock. And, if you took a RAV4, whether it's a hybrid or just, a straight internal combustion engine version, and then slapped a $15,000 battery on it and a motor, you're going to raise that price point where it's not as accessible to, every consumer. And you're not going to sell as many of them, period. And so for us, going from, our volume of RAV4s today to, for instance, a potential battery electric version all in one switch probably isn't going to be a good outcome for anybody. I don't think it's going to be an outcome for Minister Fedeli, who's in charge of economic development in Ontario. It's not going to be a good outcome for Canada. It's not going to be a good outcome for Toyota, and it's not going to be a good outcome for our employees. So we need to manage that transition carefully. So the ideal situation is if you have multiple powertrains. So for instance, say we had a hypothetical, a hybrid, a plug-in hybrid, and a BEV version of the same vehicle. If you're making all of those in the same place, you can manage that transition, and you can allocate your workforce, to each of those models and gradually manage the transition. Whereas if you have them in different places, it's a lot more problematic. So for us, we would look at, that strategy, doing them ideally all in one place, managing the transition ourselves. And then, ensuring that we've got stable production, we maintain, volume in Canada, and we also protect our team members.
Before I let you go, exactly how many jobs are we talking about? Like, how many people are producing the RAV4s at Woodstock and Cambridge right now?
Well, we've got about 8,500 people across our 3 plants in Ontario, and RAV4 is probably 70 to 80% of our total production. So you could probably argue about 70 to 80% of our people, are allocated to that production. It's a lot of people.
So it's important for us to get that transition correct.
It's important for Toyota, frankly, to get that transition correct. But obviously, there's other stakeholders involved, and including our team members, governments, Canada, Ontario, a lot of people that are impacted by our ability to manage that transition.
Thanks very much, Scott. Brendan, there seems to be a lot at stake here. At the start of this show, you gave us your expectations of the future before America passed the Inflation Reduction Act. Now that it might be enacted, what are your best case scenarios and what is your worst case scenario moving forward? Has it changed dramatically, or is it basically the same? And how many jobs are we talking about?
Yeah, so again, see the assembly side holding steady for the next little bit, although it may be some time before we get back to making 2 million or 2 million plus units annually. Assembly plants are great because they exist. We have 10 of them in Ontario, not including the medium and heavy duty stuff. So, to get some of that growth, there's some optimism. Let's fill those assembly plants up and let's support that transition over time from ICE EVs to HEVs to BEVs. Let's support that transition over time, which also lets us help the supplier base. Our really, really rich supplier base helps them manage the transition over time. And, what about a medium-term goal of getting back to 2 million units annually as part of this process? When it comes to some of the battery plants, there's some uncertainty now with the IRA. And I wonder if this is a time where kind of investors, where policymakers might kind of take stock of what's happening now, see how the IRA plays out with some policy changes in the United States, see how the startup of the battery plant in Windsor goes, see if there's some lessons to learn there. But where we do see the biggest potential for growth, because is in the integrated battery materials industry, because it doesn't exist yet. And so we're off to a good start. General Motors, Vale. That's a good example of an investment that's going to have massive economic benefits. But let's think about this in the big picture as a longer term play, to something that we can build up to more, even slightly more than 100,000 jobs across the country directly, which then, we know about these supply chain spin-off benefits. We know about just the massive contributions to government revenues that come along with mining and vehicle assembly. And so that could, if we do this right over the next decade or so, 100,000 direct jobs, more than 300,000 jobs in total when the entire when all the spin-off benefits are incorporated.
Well, that's a cheery outlook. Wow, that's great. I like it. In fact, many of the questions we got from our readers were about jobs. The auto sector is a huge employer here in Canada, and they're concerned, as they should be, for their future. So let's see if we can make some estimations, as Brendan just did. So Mark, how developed, again, you've mentioned it, is the materials processing business here in Canada. What could be a reasonable expectation for job growth if we do manage to get, all the permissions to build processing plants here in Canada?
Yeah, thanks, David. So, like I said, we've been building processing facilities in Canada for a long time. Refining facilities, we have kind of legacy sites that we've built, and we're maintaining and upgrading and that sort of thing. Certainly from a net zero perspective, how we get those to a state that they're as clean as possible today. But the thing is, like you say, David, there's no constraint on us in Canada in terms of expertise and technology. that we couldn't be building more of these facilities today. We just need the will to do it. And onshoring this work, like you say, would certainly provide a lot of high-paying, high-skilled jobs across the country. I think one of the great things about mining is it provides opportunities, certainly in remote communities, and opportunities for Indigenous employment, right? Which those are both priorities of the government and priorities for the industry to support, the folks that are closest to the mine in these remote areas. I think it also provides opportunities for R&D and innovation in these areas. And I know those are also, areas that Minister Wilkinson, Minister Champagne are both really interested in. So I think there's a lot of potential. And in terms of if we wanted to give numbers, I think, when Scott was mentioning the numbers for his facilities, we're talking similar numbers. Each one of these facilities that would need to get built, depending on the size, we're talking about, a few thousand people per to operate and maintain these facilities. So depending on how many we have the will to construct, we're certainly talking about thousands, if not tens of thousands of jobs in the future.
Okay, well, good news so far. David, what is the future of job growth in Canada from an established automaker like General Motors? Is it a conversion of major assembly plants like Oshawa to electrified vehicles? Or is future job growth going to be in ancillary areas like the cathode plant in Bécancour and R&D facilities like the Technical Center in Markham?
Yes, and yes. We're going to need to go quickly. We're moving as fast as we can. We want to make this transformation something that's an opportunity for our company and for our employees. We've added over 1,000 people in doing software in Ontario. That's a big area of opportunity because, you think about batteries, it's not just the minerals, it's the software systems to manage the batteries and get the greatest energy density out of them, etc. And we're doing that and we're testing that right in Ontario. We're adding this entire aspect of the critical minerals processing area that's all done in Asia right now. And we can bring that to North America and create massive new jobs in that area. I've been doing almost nothing but for the last 2 years in developing that area of our business in Canada. And we just happen to have extraordinary advantages. One thing we haven't mentioned as much, which we should, is our electric system. And that's another incredibly important aspect. If you're going to do all this, you also would like to do it in a way that takes advantage of the low GHG electricity grid that we have in Canada. That's really important. It's a differentiator for us versus some of the US states as well. And in some parts of Canada, we've got the lowest GHG electricity on the continent. And so that can be a big advantage too, because you have to power these plants. That's a big part of the cost of doing it. And, we're trying to hit a target of being carbon neutral in all of General Motors facilities by 2040. So that's something we think about an awful lot as well.
Well, all good news so far. I'm having a happy day. Scott, as we've heard countless times, EVs are simpler than conventional cars with up to 30% fewer parts. You mentioned 8,500 people employed in all your plants. How do you keep that entire workforce employed, or better yet, expand it if your facilities are being converted to produce only EVs?
Yeah, thanks, David. A dedicated battery electric vehicle platform, it's less work. And I think that's been widely reported and understood. You can say it's 20, 30%, doesn't really matter. It's less. But there's also a notion, in the public space right now that naturally equates to less jobs. And I understand where that comes from, but I would like to rebut it somewhat. Going back to my, basic CODA production system training, like if you had 10 workstations, as an example, and you had 600 seconds of work total, you're basically lining off a car every 60 seconds, because every 60 seconds you're progressing to a next workstation. If you turn that from 600 seconds of work down to 400 seconds of work, same 10 stations, you're lining off a car every 40 seconds. So you're actually going faster and your capacity has increased. So if you don't have the demand, that's a problem. Because you've got less work, you don't have a need to run as fast, and that would mean less people required. But, assuming the demand is there, less work content in a car can be a good thing, because it means that, you can make more of them. And the other thing to consider is, they talk about 20, 30% less work going into a car, but, and Mark touched on this earlier, like battery plants are huge operations. You're talking about, 2,000 to 5,000 people working in a battery plant, never mind, within that battery plant supply chain, upstream processes. But, some of that, assuming that you do have less people in assembly, and, again, I've said that's not a foregone conclusion, but assuming you do, some of that work can transfer to a battery plant. And assuming you are, you're doing that battery production in the same space that you were doing the automotive assembly, it's not necessarily a reduction in workforce. And, if you're not currently, doing powertrain work in Canada, and we're not doing that, I know David's company is, potentially it could actually be a net add of workers, because you're actually localizing production of powertrains that weren't there before. So it's not necessarily a bad outcome. It's something that needs to be considered, but it could actually be a positive.
Finally, just a quick follow-up on that. You've got these big plants, and batteries are huge, very heavy things, and very hard to transport. There's a strong initiative to keep your battery plant close to your final production facility, isn't there? So that, yep, with existing plants already here, there's a good chance we could get those as well. No?
Yeah, like when you're looking at a large, I'll say BEV-sized battery, typically 100 kilowatt hour battery, that's 1,000 pounds. And even if you're shipping the cells, which aren't assembled into a battery, they ship more efficiently because they'll cube out in a truck better. You're still shipping a lot of weight over potentially a long distance. And that's very, very costly. If you looked at all of the parts that go into our cars, or into a single car, pardon me, at our operations in Canada, I'm not going to disclose the number publicly, but you would be surprised, what it costs us to ship all of those parts here per unit. And a battery alone would eat up a lot of that cost just because of the scale of it, and it's heavy. And actually, I get asked sometimes, why don't you ship them by rail? Well, we're just-in-time manufacturing. We typically would do something, by truck rather than rail, but you're actually going to weigh out a truck shipping these things before you would fill it out. And so it's not particularly efficient. And because of that, you want at least the final assembly, but ideally the cell manufacturing, as close to you as an assembler as possible. Now, materials going into a battery, cathode, anode, all of that stuff, you can ship those in industrial containers. It's not just in time. That's a different discussion. But when you're talking about, batteries and cells, ideally you want them as close as possible.
Well, that would seem to be also good news for Canada and all the assembly plants that were already here that Brendan mentioned. Okay.
Well, David, if I can just jump in quickly, like right now we're 25% of all of North American manufacturing for Toyota. That's pretty significant. And, one battery plant is not going to service all of Toyota's operations in North America. So, if you're in a case where you've got a lot of battery plants over time as you're building out that capacity, there's a pretty good business case, assuming we're competitive, to do that as close to TMMC as possible. And that's what we're trying to do.
Wow. You know what? That's a high point to leave off the main panel here. That's really good news. I'd ask everybody to hang on for a few more minutes, please, because we're lucky enough today to be joined by Victor Fedeli, Ontario's Minister of Economic Development and Job Creation and Trade, who is, I think, pretty laser focused on the question of bringing new jobs to Ontario's auto sector. Minister, thanks for joining us today. So did we get anything right?
Thank you, David. I have to say it's an honor to be in such a great panel. You have got yourself a group of people here who know this industry inside out, and they got it all right. 4 A pluses right across the board. A lot of challenges ahead, and I think there's a lot of great days ahead for Canada, and particularly for Ontario. So David, just hearing some of the bullish attitude that we've had was very encouraging. And I would say right now I am in India. This is the 8th country that I've been to since the election in June, and it's all EV all the time. I've been to battery plants and cathode plants all around the world. And I can say there's nothing we can't do here in the province of Ontario that we have seen anywhere else in the world.
Thanks very much, Minister. Most analysts put China's share of the worldwide material processing and battery cell manufacturing business at about 80%. How can we compete with that moving forward?
Yeah, it's a great question. Certainly, we have a couple of advantages right in front of us, David. We have minerals in the ground, and I know Mark was very clear about some of the timelines, but I would say some of those timelines have already started. The clock on many of them had started years ago, and you're going to see lithium come out of the ground in Ontario a lot sooner, I think, than people may be aware of. And I have visited companies around the world who are genuinely interested with their checkbooks ready to convert lithium to lithium hydroxide, probably around Thunder Bay area. If I had to guess what area makes good sense with the ports and the rail there, I would say that there's a very strong opportunity. We'll see one or two of those facilities at least announced in the relatively near future. If I were being overly confident, which I usually am when it comes to being bullish on Ontario. So, I think the advantage we have is our environmental laws, our sustainability, and just what I hear around the world, whether it was in Korea or Germany or Japan, when they talk about China and they talk about the possibility of Canadian minerals. It's a very, very different discussion. So I would think our global standing, we saw the Bloomberg statistics just a week or two ago, where it puts us as the #2 ranking. That's for a reason. And if you look deep into the chart, you'll see the sustainability is a very, very big part of it. Germany, especially with their ESG requirements, they're just not going to cut it with materials from China.
A reader literally just texted me, your presence has been noticed here. Thank you very much. Is there anything more that Ontario could be doing to speed up the process that Mark talked about for 10 years? Is there some cut in bureaucracy we can do? I mean, it would seem that the time is of the essence because everybody's trying to move at light speed. Every country is trying to jump on this bandwagon. What can we do here to speed up this process?
Well, David briefly touched on it earlier when he spoke about the fact of not duplicating provincial and federal assignments in terms of due diligence. That can be, there are parts of that can be fast tracked. We just launched our critical minerals strategy here in Ontario, where we put additional millions into a fund. There can be simultaneous tracks. Now that we know there's potential sales, to me, there's unlimited sales. I think you'll sell every ounce of lithium that you bring out of the ground will be sold before you get it out of the ground. So I think fast tracking in terms of multi-tracking all of the various projects is certainly one way that we can be doing it. We can be looking at our basically all of the processes. I'm thinking of the Ring of Fire, for instance, where we're working on the environmental reports now, sort of from the north-south and from the south-north, all being done with our Indigenous communities. All of that can be done at the same time.
Minister, one of the big questions in this discussion and any discussion on this battery manufacturing in Canada has been the American Inflation Reduction Act, which we were discussing, massively incentivize automakers to build their battery plants specifically in the United States. We're talking billions of dollars. It's huge money. What can we do here in Canada and specifically Ontario to counter such incentive to attract those same battery makers to our shores?
Well, certainly, I think it was very disappointing to see that in the Inflation Reduction Act. I think it was really inserted within the last 2 weeks, if you will. Certainly the consumer side, the rebate is for all of North America, but the manufacturer's rebate, that I think what came as a very big surprise to everybody until you finally read it and find on page 418, you scratch your head and think, what the heck does that? And you, like Scott said, you get the pen out and start to do some math, and the 37 billion quickly could be 100 billion and many times that factor. I think we need a robust and decisive response from the federal government. But in the meantime, quite frankly, we look at the rest of the supply chain. There's more than just the battery plants. There certainly are the cathode plants. We have Umicore building that announced their facility in Loyalist Township. We have cathode, we have anode, we have a separator, we have copper foil. You know, for a $5 billion announcement that LG Energy Solutions made, there's got to be at least 5 billion more in those supply chains. That's all net new. So while the federal government looks to their response, and we heard Minister Freeland first talk about it in the fall economic statement, I'm not sure that we can wait to the budget to get a final response. I think that there's a chill effect that comes from the US's announcement, a chilling effect on anybody that was looking, that we need a decisive response to that. And I think, you know, and hope that that will come. But in the meantime, we continue promoting our minerals. You know, it's one thing for the Americans to say, if you want to build a battery, you have to build it in the States. But if you want to make minerals, well, we'll take them from Canada. Thank you. You know, it shouldn't work like that. I think we have leverage with our minerals, and I would hope that the federal government would consider using some of that leverage that we have in our back pocket.
I certainly agree with you on the last minute writing of that section 45X. The way I characterized it in my article, I thought it was written by a second-year law student who didn't have a professor check it over. It looked pretty amateurish to me. Nonetheless, it's real. Going forward then, you know, how many, when you look at it holistically from the global standpoint of all the industries, like Brendan did, how many jobs do you think we can build here? I mean, in Canada, I'm talking Canada. You, of course, are speaking only of Ontario, but you do you have guidelines? Do you have goals for what you want to do and what that'll translate to into high-paying jobs for Canadians?
Well, I think if you look, there's going to be a whole menu, a whole buffet in front of us. Take the LG plant in Windsor. There are thousands upon thousands of people employed to construct that building. It is a 4.5 million square foot building. To put it in Canadian terms, it's 112 hockey arenas. I mean, this is a massive facility that is going to need a lot of people, and it'll employ minimum 2,500 people when it's constructed, when it's in operation. So we see we're with Scott on this, that electric vehicle BEV does not mean fewer jobs in Ontario. We see that all new supply chain, again, the cathode, the anode, the separator, the copper foil, all with literally tens of thousands of employees collectively. So we see a net growth there. We also see a huge growth in the mining sector. You know, I live in Northern Ontario. I live in North Bay area. Every one of the 66 mining and machining companies there is incredibly busy. We make exploration equipment in North Bay. They're all hiring. They can't find enough people because there's so much exploration going on. You know, they're finding nickel north and south of Timmins, and I expect they'll be pulling nickel out of the ground in Timmins. Some say it will rival the amount of nickel in Sudbury. We know the reserves that are found in the Ring of Fire. all of this requires huge employment in the mining sector. And once the production begins, it'll be tens of thousands of people in the north as well. And I think David alluded to it. It's the first time in 120 years that Northern Ontario will be included in the auto sector. So we've got a very large net new supply chain.
Well, that's it for my questions. I've got to say this has been the most positive panel I've done in the last 4 years. I mean, you know, if all of this comes to fruition, it'll be great to be part of the Canadian automotive parts business, you know, even if I'm peripheral to the actual manufacturing. So thanks very much, Minister Fedeli, for joining us. And of course, my heartfelt thanks also to David, Scott, Brendan, and Mark for making us make sense of the most radical transformation Canada's auto industry has seen in a century. And of course, a special thanks to everyone who joined us for this crucial discussion. Lastly, if you enjoyed today's debate, listen in next week as we, at the same time as we discuss whether or not electric vehicles can really save you money. To everyone, thank you very much.